everyone, and welcome to Chapter 1. In this chapter we're going to be covering the introduction to development, covering some of the main themes and issues that are going to be relevant throughout the entire quarter. So first thing I always like to start with in my face-to-face classes is I show my students this graphic on the PowerPoint, and I ask them to come up with words that they can think of that would encapsulate the different decades of life. So for example, birth to age 9. And I challenge you to try and think of 3 words that would really characterize the things that are going on in a person's life between birth and age 9. And then from age 10 to 19, 20 to 29, and so on. So if you take a second, if you want to pause me and you want to try and complete that task, you can try and come up with 3 words that describe each of the decades that I've listed, and then come back and hear the rest that I have to say about this. Okay, so assuming you're back or that you decided you didn't want to do it, the big question is whether there was a particular decade that was easier to think of things that are challenges or events that are going on during that decade. If there are certain decades that were harder to think of words. When we do it as a class and tally up the results, we often find certain themes emerge for each of the decades. And that usually for most people, it's easier to think of words that characterize 0 to 19 than it is to think of words that characterize, for example, 30 to 69. People seem to have the hardest time doing those decades. So I thought I'd just share with you some of the common words that come up. You could kind of characterize the first decade of life as being the decade of spills, as you're trying new things, falling down, striving and then failing and those kinds of things. The next decade of life, developmentalists oftentimes characterize as the decade of drills, because that's the decade when you're really solidifying the things that you've already accumulated so far. So whereas in the first decade you learn to walk, by the second decade you're really mastering something like a sport or dance or something like that. In the first decade of life you were learning what math is, like that it exists, and you were learning 2 plus 2 and these kinds of things. By the second decade you're really drilling it down and learning how to do those things without any kind of effort, things like that. By your 20s, maybe you're starting to experience some thrills, getting to go out on your own and do things on that are independent and taking some chances. The midlife period, and I put bills across the 2 decades because really, your 30s and into your, throughout your 40s, that's where you've got a lot of responsibility. You've taken on a lot of, debt probably, and, you're managing your own life. In later mid-adulthood, you'd have, the beginning of certain kinds of symptoms of things and, things that are starting to show that the cumulative effects of aging. And then in your 70s, maybe you start needing some prescriptions or something like that. And then, in the last parts of the last few decades of life, you have, the biggest concern is, life is going to be ending and the issues that go with that. So, of course, these words were all described to be rhyming and clever, but they kind of characterize those kinds of challenges that are going on in each decade. Now, to get off of my little opening exercise, let's talk about the nature of human development. There are certain characteristics that are present that help us to be able to study and understand development. So for example, one issue is that we think of development as a continuous thing, that throughout your life you're always developing in some way. I mean, it's most obvious that you're physically developing between birth and your 20s. But throughout life you're physically developing, but also you're developing cognitively, you're developing socially throughout your whole life. It's cumulative. Those things that you've already accumulated or mastered are going to help to support the next thing that you're working on. So development builds on what's come before. It's directional. Here's a picture of a baby, and it's illustrating how physically development is top down. We call that cephalocaudal. I'll talk about that later in infancy. But cephalocaudal, so top down, and then also from the center outward. So you have most of your development physically going on in the center part and first before the extremities start to develop. So that's what we mean by directional. And you can imagine that it's directional in social and cognitive development. Also, directional is usually meaning towards more complexity in the social and in the cognitive areas, but it's definitely directional. Differentiated. As you grow and develop, your skills, your body, your ways of thinking, your relationships become more and more differentiated. Here's a picture of a fertilized egg differentiating into the different parts of a developing embryo, but that's just a physical example. We could imagine that as you age, the way that you think becomes more differentiated. The way that you interact with other people is going to become more differentiated and more organized. So here we have a baby reaching for something. When babies first start to reach, their extension of their arm is a separate behavior from the opening of their hand and then the closing of their hand. As they develop, it becomes more organized and more fluid, so that you can reach while simultaneously opening your hand and then close it when you reach the distance that your arm needs to get to, and it's just much more organized with age. And so we think that's true about all aspects of development. And then holistic. This little graphic kind of illustrates all the things that are going on in our lives. Actually, there's stuff missing, right? There's even more aspects of development that could be placed in here. And the thing is, they kind of all feed into each other, and so that your sensory development is in part dependent and influencing your physical and gross motor development, which is having an impact on your emotional development, which is having an impact on your language development, and they're all sort of interacting with each other and overlapping and all contributing to your development. So these things are all sort of taken for granted in the study of development. And then when we talk about the different theories in the next chapter, we're going to talk about sort of how each of the theories takes a different kind of angle on all of these different characteristics. That's what's really important about the different theories. All right, so continuing with the nature of human development, we think that there are three kinds of categories of age-related change that are possible. There's, for example, the shared age-graded changes. So shared means everybody goes through it. And then age-graded means that it's tied to different ages or different stages of development. So here's an example of a shared age-graded change. This would be the biological clock. So this is your nurture side. Now this is just the biological clock across the circadian rhythm. But we have biological clocks that govern, for example, the development of our visual system. So that if you are deprived of visual input during the critical period when visual development is occurring, it's actually going to harm your ability to see things, right? And that's governed by the biological clock. There's not a lot that can be done to offset the predetermined biologically governed changes and development that's going to occur. And all of us go through it, so it's considered shared. Now, the social clock is not shared by all humans necessarily. It's shared within a culture or a subculture. And this would be more of a nurture side of the argument, where, this was somebody's project at a science fair, I think, where they tried to draw the social clock. And they're showing sort of what things are, the order, that's probably the right word, the order of things that happen in American society. It's not necessarily a requirement that everything has to be done in this order, but you'll notice that they've got you're a baby, and then you go to school, and then they have learning to drive a car as a major milestone, because this was a kid drawing this, graduating from high school, then they've got getting married, having a baby after that, and then working, and ultimately retirement. So these are like the expectation of the order of things that might happen. Now, just because that's the social clock in a given culture doesn't mean that everybody has to do it. Like in the biological clock, you pretty much have to have things happen at certain times. But with the social clock, there's more variance. And in fact, our textbook talks a little bit about how the social clock is starting to fall out of favor as an explanation of people's behavior. But I like to include it because I think all of us can relate to feeling the pressure from other people that we should be doing this or that right now, or that now that we've done this, the next natural thing for us to do is that. So any of you who are married but don't have children yet might be getting that kind of pressure from people that, well, now that you're married, you guys should be having kids. When are you having kids? When can I expect grandkids? When will you be having children? It's like, wait, I just got married. Well, the social clock tells us the next thing you do is you have kids. If you've had kids and aren't married, you might have been asked, well, when are you guys getting married? Are you guys going to get married? What's going on? Because the assumption is that, well, you've done one of the behaviors, we expect you to do the other one. I think we've all had those kinds of pressures. You start dating anybody for long enough time and you start getting pressure, when are you getting married, right? I mean, these are sort of people being friendly and inquisitive, but they're also giving us little subtle cues about what we're supposed to be doing. You graduated from high school and the first thing people start asking is, what are you doing next? What school are you going to? Are you joining the military? What are you doing? Right? There's like this assumption that now that you've done one thing, we sort of expect you to do the next thing. And so I think we all kind of still feel a little bit of the social clock pressure, even though developmentalists are trying to sort of underplay the influence of the social clock on our behaviors. All right. Still under the category of nature of the human development, we've got these three categories. So we've got the shared age-graded ones, which I just described. Then we have what are called cultural and cohort effects. On the left side of the screen, I have pictures of people from different cultures just to illustrate that, not only is style largely dictated by our culture, which is what's being illustrated here, but also things like our social clock can be affected by our culture. The amount of education that is considered adequate can vary by culture. What males are supposed to be doing versus what females are supposed to be doing can be dictated by culture. And all of these things can have impacts on our development. Those are just a few examples of the things that we'll encounter across the quarter. On the right side of the screen, I have the cohort effects. And so you can see different cohorts described here. And some of you might even be younger than the millennials that are on the right-hand side. Right now they're calling people who were born between 2001 and 2015, they're calling them Generation Z because they don't know yet what they're going to end up, what's going to be important and meaningful that they can label them with. But the idea is that we can kind of assume certain things about people based on the generation or the cohort that they were born within. And so in this graphic, you can see the kinds of things that are assumed to be true of people who are in these different generations. Just to give you a little perspective from an elder here, I'm a Gen Xer, and when I was in the age that millennials currently are, us Gen Xers were considered people who like to job hop. So I think what they're doing is just describing general traits of people in that age bracket, and then kind of forgetting that it's not necessarily a cohort effect, it might be an age-related effect in this chart. So some of the things that we assume about you because you were born during a particular era are cohort effects. And this issue is going to come up a number of times during the quarter, that the idea that you were born and raised during a particular time in history, and that might have an effect on your development. My last example, the third category of age-related change, would be the unique non-shared events. So things like I mentioned earlier with the critical period for vision development. If you're deprived of vision during that critical period, it can interfere with the normal development of that ability. We're usually going to be talking about biological clock issues when we talk about critical periods, because there aren't that many things that we can say that are social clock issues that have critical periods where it must occur or not occur for normal development to occur, right? So there aren't that many things that you can think of that are critical for the social clock. Instead, most commonly for the social clock, we're talking about sensitive periods. Here we have a graphic that's showing sensitive periods in early brain development. Your brain has a certain amount of ability to compensate or do some catch-up growth or things like that if there's a slight delay or something that interferes temporarily. And so you may or may not get effects if an event occurs or not during a sensitive period. So with a sensitive period, you're more likely to have an effect, but not guaranteed to have an effect. Whereas with a critical period, you are going to have an effect if that event occurs or not. So critical periods, you have to have certain experiences or avoid certain experiences. Sensitive periods, we might want to try not to have you have these certain experiences, or try to ensure that you do have these certain experiences because it might affect your development. So I hopefully made it really clear that we're not exactly sure with sensitive periods whether you'll get an effect or not. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about research design in developmental research. And they're really, okay, now remember, in developmental research, the key variable that we're interested in is the effect of age on some kind of outcome. We're really interested in the aging process, right? The developmental process. So here I've made a little chart where I've got different cohorts of people born in 1925, 35, 45, blah, blah, through 95. And then I've got the year that the measurement occurred on, along the left side. So we measured in 1930, 1940, blah, blah, through. We've got one more data collection coming up in 2020. Okay, so there are different ways that we can go about assessing the effect of aging. Cross-sectional research, which popped up there in the right-hand corner. Cross-sectional research would be when we take, I highlighted it in matching teal here. Let's say that as a researcher, I was working on a study in 2010 where I was interested in the effect of aging. So I grabbed a bunch of people who were at the time, so one group of people was 15, one group of people was 25, another was, so these are each individual groups, right? These are the years that they were born across the top, and then each of those groups is a different group of people. And I'm going to compare the scores on whatever variable I'm interested in. Let's say that I'm interested in, whether people have 2 languages or 1, if that's affected by age. So like, does age impact your fluency in a second language? So I grab a bunch of people who are currently different ages and I test them for their knowledge of a second language. Now, if I see differences between the groups, I'm going to try and make the argument that the difference is due to aging. So I might find that the participants who are 65, 75, 85 are much less likely to be bilingual than people who are 15 or 25 years old. And I might make the argument that when those 15 and 25-year-olds are 65 to 85 years old, they will be less bilingual than they are today. I might want to make that argument. But we have to be really careful, because when we talk about cross-sectional research, we are really, really risking the cohort effect. There might be something significantly different in the upbringing or environment of the 15 and 25-year-olds than was present for the 65, 75, 85-year-olds when they were growing and developing. So for example, the 15 and the 25-year-olds might be more likely to have had classes in a second language while they were in school. Or they may have had more exposure to people who spoke a second language, and that helped to motivate them to pick up the second language that the 65, 75, and 85-year-olds didn't have. So when we get cross-sectional research data back, we have to be really careful in our interpretation of any differences that we're seeing being a function of aging, and be aware that they might be a function of different eras, different cohorts. So another way that we could collect data is the longitudinal method, and that would be if we decided to get rid of the cohort effect and instead follow people across their lifespan. So let's say that, I'm apparently really, really old because I was able to start collecting data in 1930, and I started when these people who were born in 1925 were 5 years old, and every 10 years I retested those individuals, and every 10 years I was checking to see whether their bilingual fluency was maintained. Like, did it stay stable across their lifespan? And if I find that there's stability, then I could say, well, maybe the cross-sectional data that showed that there was a difference in the youngest participants versus the oldest participants was really just an artifact of the cohort effect, because if you follow an individual across time, their skill set stays consistent. So I could be making an argument for aging that's a little bit more confident than you can when you do a cross-sectional study. Of course, there's a problem with longitudinal data also. For one, let's say had I been old enough to be collecting data in 1930, I'm pretty sure I'm no longer collecting data by 2020, right? So one big problem with longitudinal research is that the researchers usually are gone if you're doing this kind of long longitudinal study. There's actually one that we'll be looking at later in the textbook that is talking about the Seattle study of intelligence that's been going on since 1935. And, while some of the participants are still alive, the researchers are mostly gone, and we're on like our second and third generation of, researchers who are conducting these newer data. So that's something. A lot of times with longitudinal data, we don't really go over these many years though. A lot of times we're interested in, let's say, infant development, and we might collect data when the infant is 6 months old, 9 months old, and 12 months old. So probably the researcher is going to make it through that. So let's look at what else is wrong with longitudinal. It could be the case that not all the participants return for all of the data collection points. That's a significant problem. It's called attrition, where the research participants don't all come back. And so you may end up with maybe the ones who were enjoying it the most, or who were least likely to have moved. And therefore we could infer maybe have stable home lives or something like that. Like these other confounds can pop up to explain why some participants return for data collection and some don't. In a long-term study like the Seattle intelligence study, or in this fake study I'm showing you on the screen, we might worry that people are actually literally dying off during the study, and that there might be something fundamentally different between those who are still alive at the end of the study and those who have died off. So attrition is a significant problem in longitudinal research. So developmental researchers have come up with a third strategy that's kind of a hybrid between cross-sectional and longitudinal, and it's called sequential. So the idea behind a sequential design is that you start off as if you're doing a cross-sectional study. So here I've highlighted, I started collecting data in 1950, and I studied people who were at the time of the first data collection 5, 15, or 25 years old. Okay, and so my first set of data would be comparing just those three groups. Then 10 years later, I come back, I retest those same groups. So we have the beginning of a longitudinal study, right? Each of those first three groups is providing 2 data points. So I can look to see whether those individuals are changing over time, as well as whether there's a difference between groups. And I'm going to go ahead and add a new group of 5-year-olds in my second data collection. And then I come back in 1970, retest those same 4 groups and add a new group. Come back in 1980, retest those same 5 groups and add a new group, and so on. This is actually how the Seattle longitudinal study has been being conducted recently, and so now it's no longer a longitudinal study only, it's a sequential study. So we've been following certain people since 1935, and then they've been adding new cohorts every 7 years so that they can get cross-sectional data as well as longitudinal data. That helps us to correct for the cohort effect. So if we see differences between groups that don't persist within an individual as they move through those ages, we can start to say, yeah, see, that looks like a cohort problem. When the 5-year-olds in 1950 score differently from the 25-year-olds in 1950, but then those 25-year-olds in 1950 score no differently than themselves when they're 45, we can say, well, within each individual, this is a stable trait. What we've really tapped into is a cohort effect, where when you were raised has an impact. Similarly, with the problem with attrition that we get with longitudinal data, we're always adding new cohorts into this study, and so even as our oldest participants might be dropping off, we're adding the new younger participants. So this can sort of keep going on pretty much into infinity. So the sequential design is sort of the gold standard of developmental research techniques. It's got some issues. It takes more time, it takes more resources to conduct these, and a lot of our research starts off as cross-sectional. And so when you read studies in the textbook, you're going to notice a lot of them are just cross-sectional studies. And it might be that this is the first set of data, and in our in 5 years when our textbook is updated again, it may have the second set, and it's really a sequential design over the long term. Or it might be that it was a one-shot deal and they really literally only did a cross-section. It takes a lot of time and a lot of money to do the longitudinal component, and so it limits us in our understanding of human development, that's for sure. All right, now let's transition quickly into some research methods, and this is just to give you an overview of the way that data can be collected in developmental research. There are lots of different options available. Experiments would be the best, most solid way to collect data. In a experiment, I'm going to use Bandura's Bobo doll experiment, which he did in 1961 and 1963. In an experiment, you need an independent variable. So here's Bobo. He's the clown. It's a blow-up doll that has sand in the bottom, and really the only thing you can do with a Bobo doll is punch him and kick him and throw him. There's really nothing else to do with a Bobo doll, but it was an actual kid's toy in the 1960s. So in the Bandura experiment, they had children watch videos of, well, they were film strips of adults interacting with Bobo. And the independent variable was, in some conditions, the adult was behaving in a very neutral way with Bobo, where the adult was just sitting next to Bobo and not really doing anything. In the experimental condition, the adult, and half the time it was a male and half the time it was a female to make sure there wasn't a sex effect, but anyway, you're just seeing the female. The adult did stuff with the Bobo doll that had never been observed spontaneously in children. In the one she's throwing him, in the other one she's hitting him with a hammer. There are a few other things that they had her do. They had her straddle Bobo and punch him in the face, and there were a couple of things that she did that, or in the male condition that he did, that they had never seen a child spontaneously do. So this was the independent variable. We're either exposing the adult to the child to an adult just behaving neutrally with Bobo, or we're exposing the child to an adult being violent towards Bobo in ways that children are not normally violent towards Bobo. The experimental group witnessed the violent condition. The control group experienced the neutral condition, where the adult just sat there with Bobo. The key thing to make something an experiment is to randomly assign your participants to condition. So each child had an equal chance of witnessing the violent interaction with Bobo or the neutral interaction with Bobo. Each child has to have an equal chance of being in the experimental condition or the control condition in order for us to be confident that any individual differences between children in their natural violent tendencies or whatever have been distributed between the two groups, so that we can really get at the effect of the independent variable. What we're interested in measuring is the dependent variable. So in this case, we're looking at how the children reacted to Bobo when they were given free play with Bobo. And so what they were really looking for is, in both conditions, was whether the children displayed any of these specific behaviors that the adults had been displaying. And so you see the kid in this picture throwing Bobo, you see the kid in this picture hitting Bobo with a hammer, just like you saw the adult. And if we see those kinds of behaviors in the experimental group more than we see in the control group, then we can assume, or we can infer, that the experimental condition caused the increase in violent behaviors in the children. The benefits of this method is that this is the only method that would allow us to establish causation, that we did this and that caused that, right? So we showed some children the adult hitting Bobo with a hammer, and only when the children saw an adult beating up Bobo with a hammer did the children beat up Bobo with a hammer. So we can say seeing that caused the children to behave in that way. Of course, there are problems with experiments. For one, the number one biggest problem is that since our number one question of interest is whether age impacts certain things, right? That's what developmental psychology is all about. We can't really randomly assign you to be an age, right? We can't randomly assign some people to be 8 and some people to be 28, right? You are whatever age you are. And so experiments are not possible in a lot of the things that we're interested in developmental psychology. So we have other options. Quasi-experiment would be the most common alternative to the experiment. So everything looks the exact same in a quasi-experiment as in an experiment. The one difference is there is no random assignment of participants. So we admit I can't place you in a different condition. You're going to come to me already in a different condition. So for example, if I'm interested in the effect of gender on some outcome, well, I can't assign some people to be male and some people to be female. They are whatever they are. And so I use that pre-existing group and compare them. Or ethnicity. That's something else I can't assign people to be, right? I can't assign you to be a high achiever as previously measured by your teacher, or a low achiever, right? So you come to me already in those groups. I can't assign you to be a person who receives free lunch or not. And so those are things that you come already assigned to your group. And so if I want to use one of those characteristics as an independent variable, that means by definition I'm doing a quasi-experiment. And you guys probably know quasi means sort of or not real. So we're going to use pre-existing differences as our independent variable. Now we do this a lot in psychology, and this is one of the things that makes people criticize the social sciences, is that we oftentimes use pre-existing differences as the independent variable. So what's wrong with that? Whereas the benefit is we can study things that we couldn't otherwise do, right? If I can't randomly assign you and I say, well, I guess I can't study that question, we're not going to be able to get insight into certain questions. So the benefit is it allows us to study things that we otherwise couldn't study. The problem is we just have to be really careful about the inferences that we draw from quasi-experiments, because we have to be aware that, for example, if we're going to use sex as an independent variable, sex is not an independent variable. There are a lot of confounds that go along with being one sex or the other, right? So we can't say, because you're male, you scored like this. We can't say that. All we can say is that on average the males score differently from the females, and then be aware that there are other potential mitigating factors besides sex, the way that they're treated, the social structure, whatever things that could be also causing the effect. So we can never say one thing causes another in a quasi-experiment. All we can say is that it appears that it's more likely among this group versus that group, or other very careful phrases. If you want to get even more careful, we can use correlational research. Correlational research is when we have two variables, each of them that produce numbers that are what we call continuous. That means they could be any number between 0 and infinity. So two variables like age. Age is a great example of a continuous variable. You could be anything between birth and death, right? So that's a nice continuous variable. Height, score on an SAT test. GPA is an example of a correlational variable. It can be anything between 0 and whatever the maximum is for the grading system. Family income, all of these things are examples of correlational, are examples of continuous variables. Also in psychology, we're really interested in scores on surveys and things like that. Those tend to be continuous variables. So anything like that. I use the example of how much violent TV a child watches as one continuous variable, and the numbers could be anywhere between 0 and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whatever that would be. And then the amount of aggressive behavior. And again, it could be 0 or it could be whatever maximum number, right? So we've got two variables and they're both continuous. And we make a prediction. We might say that children who watch more violent TV will display more aggressive behavior. Okay, so we might make the prediction that amount of TV seems to lead to the amount of aggressive behavior. The benefits of this method is, again, it allows us to assess things that maybe otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. If we limited ourselves just to experiments, we wouldn't be able to study a lot of questions. The problems, there are a couple. One is when we see correlations between two things, we oftentimes assume that it means something. So here we have this pompous guy saying, after interviewing thousands of people, I have found a strong correlation exists between being smart and agreeing with me. Just because two things go together doesn't mean that they're related to each other. So it's possible that the amount of violent TV that a kid watches leads to the amount of aggressive behavior that they display, But it could also be that more aggressive kids who behave more aggressively, are more attracted to watching violent television. And so it could be that the amount of violent TV leads to the amount of aggressive behavior, but it's just as possible that the amount of aggressive behavior leads to the amount of violent TV. And the problem with the correlation is we can never figure out which way that arrow should flow. There's no way to figure it out. So that's definitely a problem. It's what we call the directionality problem. We literally cannot figure out which way that, if there is a causal link, which way the cause flows. So we don't know if it's TV leading to behavior or behavior leading to TV. The other thing that is a problem is that there might be some third variable, like your parents not being home after school, that leads you to be able to watch whatever you want on TV without any kind of input, and allows you to go, get into fights with your siblings or with your neighbors or whatever, because there are no adults to sort of keep people in check. It could be that violent TV and the aggressive behavior are not causally related at all. They're both just existing because of their relationship to this third variable. We call this one creatively the third variable problem. So with correlations, we can never sort this out. There's no way for us to know. And so we're going to probably use either quasi-experiments, or maybe if we can figure out a way to do it, an experiment to try and sort out where the relationship really lies. But just to wrap it up on a positive note, the benefit of this method is that it gives us insights into things and gives us an idea that things are related to each other. We just can't go to that causal place. So here's something I found in, I think it was Better Homes and Gardens, and it says, brain food. Teens who steer clear of junk food aren't just thinner, they're also less likely to suffer from depression and anxiety. In a new study, kids who ate at least 2 fruit and 4 veggie servings each day and avoided fast food, sweets, and soda were less likely to show symptoms of mental health problems. Researchers believe sugar and saturated fat may be damaging to the immune system, which in turn can raise the risk for psychiatric issues. So notice how this magazine reported this as if the sugar and saturated fat are causing a physical thing to happen, which is then causing the psychiatric thing. But all they've got is this is purely correlational. There is no way that you can assign kids to eat what you want them to eat for some period of time. And even if you can get them to do it for some period of time, that would be enough time to actually have the effect that you're expecting, right? How long would you have to put the kids on the fruits and veggie diet, no fast food diet? How long would you have to do it to get the effect? You don't even know, right? And so the teens who steer clear are probably doing that on their own or with significant goading from their parents. So we probably know how much junk food the kids eat through self-reports, right? They probably report what they eat, or their parents report on their behalf how much junk food they eat. And then they probably took a scale to assess their depression and a scale to assess their anxiety. And then the researchers believe that the sugar and saturated fat may be damaging the immune system, which there is some physical evidence that that's true, and then made the leap that it may increase the risk of psychiatric issues like depression and anxiety. That's a huge series of leaps to make based on correlational evidence. We can't make those kinds of strong assertions. We can't say that if we take a kid who's depressed and anxious and start feeding them fruits and vegetables and depriving them of junk food, soda, and sweets, that their moods would improve or their anxiety would go down. We can't say that. We could try it. If you want, you're more than welcome to try that, but there's nothing in this data that would allow us to make that assumption, because this data is correlational data. So we have to be really super careful. When you read stuff like this, you have to be really super careful. They imply in the media as if we find the cure or the cause, when in fact all we have is correlational data. Now, another way that we can collect data in developmental research is through observation. And this is fairly common in research on children because they're kind of easier to observe. They may be less influenced by observations. And then also in couples We oftentimes will look at family dynamics and things like that using observational methods. So there are different types. There's the naturalistic observation where you actually go to where the behavior normally would be admitted. So here we are in like a preschool or a daycare center, and the researcher would try and just blend into the background and not interfere with what these kids are doing, and then just observe the children's behavior for whatever they're looking for, dominance hierarchies or cooperation or whatever they're looking for. In a field study, let's pretend like, I just, by the way, found these pictures on the internet, so I don't know who any of these people are. Let's pretend that the person who's clearly reading to the children, let's pretend like that's a researcher. And let's pretend like the researcher is actually reading a particular story to try and elicit certain behaviors from those children. That would be what we call a field study, where we're setting it up in their natural environment. We're still in the daycare center. But now we're actually manipulating some aspect of that environment to try and see what effect that has. So the choice of the study, or by having a male researcher read the story to some of the children and a female researcher read the story to some of the other children, or something like that. So we could do field study where we're manipulating something, but not everything about the environment. The benefits of this method is that we can literally see the behavior in its natural setting, and so it's less likely to be, an artifact. It's less likely to be something that is happening only because you're in an experiment and never would happen like this in real life. So we can generalize that if we see kids in this daycare center behaving this way, probably other kids like them in another daycare center would behave the same way. The problem is that we don't have control over anything in this situation. We have no ability to, know who recently ate and who didn't, whose parents had a fight at home before they dropped them off, we have no idea what else is going on. And so as a result, we have no control, and so our inferences are going to be a lot less confident than even with a quasi-experiment where we have as much control as we can over the things we have control over. Here we have control over nothing. My last method happens to be the most popular method, and that's the questionnaire. The questionnaire is the most popular method. Interviews are down a little bit lower, where you actually either talk to somebody on the phone or you bring them face to face. Either situation is basically a survey where we're going to ask certain kinds of questions and record answers. In questionnaires, it's going to be a very standard set of questions, and so like this picture that you're seeing is a great example where you state how much you do this behavior or how much you agree with a statement or something like that. Interviews sometimes can be a little bit more flexible, where based on your answer to one question, I might ask you something different as the next question than I would have if you had answered a different way, right? So it's a little more flexible. I can kind of tailor the questions based on your responses. The benefits of these methods are, for one thing, they're super inexpensive, especially when we do anything written. A written questionnaire, even on paper, is really inexpensive. A lot of times we include questionnaires as part of other studies that we might be doing. So when a participant shows up for a study, the first thing they might do is take a little questionnaire, maybe a personality questionnaire, or maybe an attitude questionnaire, or maybe even just a demographics questionnaire, so that we know what kinds of people are participating in our studies. So interviews are going to be a lot more expensive because we're going to have to actually have people talk to the participants one-on-one, and it's going to be expensive in time, and then it's also going to be like monetarily expensive, where we either have to go to the person's place or get them to come to us, and it's a lot more cumbersome. It's become really easy to administer questionnaires these days because we can do online questionnaires, and usually my online students have an opportunity to participate in real research as extra credit in my classes, because I always have questionnaires ongoing, and so I usually will give you guys that opportunity somewhere around the mid-quarter. Some of the problems, this is one of the problems I have with administering these questionnaires to my students, is that sometimes my participants want the extra credit, but they don't really feel like spending the time doing the survey, and so their answers may not be reliable, or they maybe give answers that are socially appropriate but aren't necessarily representative of what they really do or think or feel, and so we may get misleading answers. Sometimes participants don't even really know what they think about a particular topic because they've never really thought about it before, but then they feel pressured to give an answer. Sometimes with these kinds of ranking scales, the respondent doesn't like having to pick one of these kinds of answers. They're like, I don't know, I feel like I'm between sometimes and rarely, and they have difficulty trying to answer the survey like that. Sometimes the way that we've worded the questions can be a problem. Sometimes the respondent doesn't know what a particular word means, and so they answer based on their best guess, and their best guess was wrong. And so they've given an answer that's misleading because of that. Sometimes they're embarrassed about the real answer, so they give other answers. I mean, there are a lot of problems with surveys for sure, but you're going to notice a lot of surveys in your textbook because this is absolutely the most popular way that psychologists have of collecting data and finding out what people think about things. So surveys are here to stay. We just have to be careful about our inferences about all the different methods have their problems, that's for sure. And so just always be a little wary, and if you don't like the results of a particular study, think to yourself, well, maybe it's something about how they collected the data that might be the problem. Maybe I'm not in the majority, not because I'm not in the majority, but because the way that they designed the study is faulty. So that's always the kind of thing that you need to be thinking about as you read through our textbook. All right, that completes Chapter 1's lecture. I will talk to you guys in Chapter 2.